All right, guys. So a couple of days ago over in the U.S. Senate, they held a hearing on hate crimes in the United States. And predictably, Republicans use this as an opportunity to bend the knee to Israel and to show their undying support for the current genocide in Gaza. And I got two different clips here. The first one is Ted Cruz. This is a warm-up, okay, for what we're about to witness in the second clip that I have for you guys from Louisiana Senator John Kennedy. So as egregious as this one is, somehow this wasn't the worst from the day. Let's go ahead and jump in to Ted Cruz smearing college students who have been protesting against the fact that our government is sending the bombs to Israel, that they are dropping on the heads of thousands of innocent Palestinian children. Let's go ahead and hear what he has to say about this.
When it comes to anti-Semitism, the Democrats have a problem. I would note, this is occurring in blue states with blue governors because the Democrat Party is terrified of the pro-Hamas wing of their party. In states like Texas and Florida, we don't allow this. At the University of Texas, when violent protesters threatened Jewish students, police officers arrived and arrested them. That's what happened when you enforce the law. Every Republican member of this committee asked the chairman to hold a hearing on anti-Semitism in February. And yet we don't get a hearing on anti-Semitism. We get a hearing generically on hate because this administration, and this is the kind of anger and hate that is encouraged. You're now seeing the hate manifesting right here. Interestingly enough,
Please, the committee will come to order. The senator is recognized to finish his remarks.
So we now have a demonstration of anti-Semitism. We have a demonstration of the hate. Rabbi Goldfeder, let me ask you, has the Biden administration cut off the funding of any of the colleges that have allowed this hate? Have they indicted anyone for funding these violent protests? Have they indicted the people paying for the matching tents? Or have they sat there silently, and have the universities sat there silently while their students are terrified to go to class?
They have not indicted anyone.
They have not indicted anyone. Has any university had their funding cut off for allowing this sort of violent intimidation?
Not a single university.
I can tell you this. Next year,
Senator's
if there is
time
a
has
Republican
expired.
majority on this committee, you will see real leadership. And next year, if there's a Republican administration, you will see people prosecuted for this sort of violence. This is being tolerated with the looking away, the blind eye being turned from this administration and this Department of Justice. And it is utterly disgraceful. And under Title VI, any university that allows this should have their funding cut off.
Okay, so obviously there's a lot to say about that clip. Let's just start off with this, right? Because conservatives, Republicans, for the last couple of years have been attempting to portray themselves as the party of free speech, the party that is standing against this widespread problem of liberal censorship in this country. Here we have a prominent senator from the state of Texas who is calling not only for schools that allow for anti-genocide protests to take place on campus to be defunded, but also for the students to be prosecuted, right? Now, he portrays this as violence, right? Even though 99% of these student protesters have been entirely peaceful. In fact, the violence usually gets ramped up when the police are sicked on them at some of these college campuses. He's calling for them to be prosecuted, right? He is calling for these schools to be defunded because they are allowing these protests against Israel to take place. And on top of that, we have the Republican nominee for president right now, Donald J. Trump, who is extending that and calling for some of these protesters to be deported from the United States. Now, does that sound like to you guys the party of free speech? The party standing against anti-censorship, right? The same party, by the way, that supports anti-BDS laws that make it essentially impossible to support boycott, divestment, sanction, the same movement that was used against the apartheid state of South Africa. Does this sound like the free speech, the anti-censorship party to you guys? He's making a promise here. He's saying if Trump wins the election and Republicans are in control of the legislature, then they will prosecute anybody who dares to go and protest against this apartheid genocidal state of Israel that we are arming, funding, giving diplomatic cover for, which is the second layer of irony in this kind of a testimony, which is that Ted Cruz is portraying the Democratic Party as pro-Hamas. This is the same party. Under Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, most of the Democratic establishment that is elected in the House and the Senate, that has been sending billions and billions of dollars to Israel to continue with this genocide. For now 11 months, they've been allowing Benjamin Netanyahu to commit war crime after war crime after war crime and to sabotage ceasefire negotiations over and over again, to escalate with his neighbors to the point now where we are on the brink of an escalation towards a broader war with the Houthis and Hezbollah and potentially even Iran, that Israel, of course, wants the United States to fight on their behalf. I mean, the idea that in a testimony that you're supposed to be giving on hate crimes in the United States, that you are focusing on, number one, the Democratic Party, which again is overwhelmingly doing the bidding of the Israeli government, and also you're going to focus on college students who have generally been on the right side of history throughout every single major conflict in the last, 60 years. This is what you're going to focus on in this hate crimes hearing, right? Now, keep in mind, he said there that he wanted, and other Republicans wanted, an anti-Semitism specific hearing, which in general, in principle, is not something I would even have a problem with, right? Anti-Semitism is a real problem, but you know what undercuts the ability for us to fight against real anti-Semitism is when you conflate criticism of an apartheid state or a state that is in the midst of committing a genocide like Israel, when you conflate critique of that government apparatus, that state apparatus, with criticism of Judaism or with criticism of Jews across the board. That is deflating our ability to adequately confront anti-Semitism when it actually rears its head in the form mostly of, in the current day, like neo-Nazis, for example. Neo-Nazis like Nick Fuentes, who had a dinner, famously, a sit-down dinner with Donald Trump himself. So Ted Cruz wants to sit here and pretend as if his top priority is fighting against bigotry, fighting against anti-Semitism, or whatever the case may be. And it's obvious bullshit. It's obvious bullshit, right? This is defense in service of the state of Israel. This is not defense in service of the Jewish people broadly. Part of the reason why I know that for a fact is that at many of these protests that I've been to, at many of these protests that, have taken place outside of the White House, protesting the Biden-Kamala administration, by the way, or many of these protests that have taken places on college campuses are led by Jewish organizations, Jewish Voices for Peace, or If Not Now, or Jewish students who happen to go to some of these universities. They're helping to lead some of these anti-genocide protests. And Ted Cruz is very comfortable sitting up here smearing them as anti-Semites. I mean, it's just absurd. By the way, the same Ted Cruz, who just a couple days ago, I saw on his own Twitter feed, was perpetuating this bullshit racist narrative against Haitian migrants, that they are stealing and eating people's pets in Springfield, Ohio. That same Ted Cruz wants you to know that he cares very deeply about bigotry in the United States. I mean, come on. Who believes this shit? Now, we also have, again, an escalation from the clip that we just witnessed. Here we have Louisiana Senator John Kennedy, who is questioning Maya Berry, who is, I think, the executive director of the Arab American Institute. And again, guys, this is supposed to be a hearing on hate crimes, right? And in this clip, you are going to witness a U.S. senator, a Republican, who is being incredibly racist against this Arab American Institute representative. Let's watch this clip. Now, also, one other thing that I wanted to mention about Ted Cruz's commentary there is that, again, we're talking about hate crimes. Now, you could say, again, that anti-Semitism is a legitimate issue, whether it's in the United States or it's in Europe or it's in other places around the world. That's fine. I'm definitely willing to have that conversation and how we go about addressing that in a real way. But over the last 11 months, we have seen an incredible amount of violence and threats directed towards Arab Americans in this country. For example, there was a shooting back in November of 2023, against a few Palestinian Americans in Vermont. They were shot because they were Palestinian in this country. Ted Cruz wants to have a conversation about anti-Semitism because he can disingenuously weaponize it in service of supporting the Israeli government under Benjamin Netanyahu, but he doesn't want to have a broader conversation about, anti-Arab hate or, hate crimes against Arab Americans or Muslim Americans or whatever the case may be. And here we have John Kennedy from Louisiana, again, being just unbelievably racist in this hate crime Senate hearing. Let's go ahead and watch this. Again, this is the, I think, executive director of the Arab American Institute. Here we go.
And according to your website, you're also, I'm going to quote here, a longtime Democratic Party activist who served as a member of the 2016 Democratic National Convention's Platform Standing Committee, close quote. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. You support Hamas, do you not?
Senator, oddly enough, I'm going to say thank you for that question because it demonstrates the purpose of our hearing today in a very
Let's start
effective
first
way.
with a yes or no.
Hamas is a foreign terrorist organization that I do not support, but you asking the executive director of the Arab American Institute that question very much puts the focus on the issue of hate in our country.
Well, I got your answer, and I appreciate it. What is the, you support Hezbollah, too, don't you?
Again, I find this line of questioning extraordinarily disappointing,
Is that a no?
Senator. That
Or
you have Arab American constituents that you represent
is
in your
that
great state.
Yes, ma'am, I understand that, but my time's limited, and I apologize, but is that a yes or a no?
A yes or no question to do I support Hezbollah? The answer is I don't support violence, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, or any other entity that invokes
You
it.
can't
So
bring
no, sir.
yourself to say no, can you?
No, I can say no. I can say yes.
But
What
you
I can
haven't.
say is
You just
your
can't
line
make
of
yourself do
questioning.
it. Do you
Senator,
support or oppose Iran and their hatred of Jews?
Again, I'm going to emphasize Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, none of them is going to, this
you can't
discussion.
bring yourself to say no, can
Sir,
you?
I don't support.
It's real simple.
Excuse me, I'm going to,
Ian,
if I may, as a Muslim woman, sir, I'm going to tell you I do not support Iran. But what I will tell you is that this conversation.
I'm running out of time. I'm
Okay.
sorry. You called our decision to
Please.
cut funding. You called our decision to cut fund. Well, first, what's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency?
It's UNRWA, which is the institution that exists to provide services and aid to the nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees.
And you called our decision to cut funding for them, quote, an incredible moral failure,
Yes.
close quote.
That
Yes.
is absolutely correct. But again, I would suggest that conversation
And
is about foreign policy.
we did that because 9 UNRWA staff members were fired for actually helping Hamas on October 7th.
my
Isn't that the
God.
case?
I don't believe that that's correct in terms
Let me
of.
ask
So
you one more
please.
time. You support Hamas, don't you? You
Sir.
support UNRWA and Hamas, don't you?
Sir,
Please.
I think it's exceptionally disappointing that you're looking at an Arab American witness before you and saying you support Hamas.
You know what's disappointing to me?
I do not
You
support
can't
Hamas.
Bring yourself
I do
to
not
say
support Hamas
You don't
or any-
support UNRWA. You don't support Hamas. You don't
was very
support
clear in my support for UNRWA.
Hezbollah, and you don't
I
support Iran.
oppose-
You should hide your head in a bag.
Yeah. So his final quote there was, "You should hide your head in a bag." Now, I think it should be pretty obvious from his line of questioning there that he wasn't interested in having a good faith back and forth on what the Arab American Institute believes in or what this specific person, Maya Berry, believes in. He was interested in smearing Arab Americans, smearing this organization here, the Arab American Institute, and smearing Muslim Americans across the country. That's what he was interested in. She even answered his question directly. Do you support Hamas? No, I don't support Hamas. In fact, I don't support any organization, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas or the IDF or whatever the case may be, that engages in violence against civilians, right? She made that explicitly clear. She answered the question multiple times, and he still, at the end of that, followed up with another question. Do you support Hamas? You refuse to say whether or not you support Hamas. And then, of course, he adds on the conflation between Hamas and UNRWA. UNRWA, as she accurately pointed out there, is an organization that has existed for decades that is tasked with supporting millions of Palestinians who have been displaced and become refugees because of the government of Israel and their ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, right? So the attacks against UNRWA I've covered so extensively on this channel that I almost don't even think that it's worth it at this point to get into the details again. But this was a classic Israeli smear against an organization they have had beef with for decades. They don't want any sort of a United Nations organization that is tasked with even the recognition that Palestinian refugees exist in the first place. And so, of course, the Israeli government has been running with this narrative that UNRWA is the same as Hamas, and Hamas is the same as ISIS, and ISIS is the same as Hezbollah. Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is the same as Iran. We've heard all of these talking points a million times over, time and time again. And here we have a U.S. senator during a hate crimes hearing who is looking at an Arab American, a Muslim woman, who is testifying on a hearing on hate crimes. I can't get over that. A hearing on hate crimes. And he is smearing her as pro-Hamas. You endorse everything that Hamas has ever done. You endorse everything that Hezbollah has ever done. And honestly, she has way more patience than I would ever have in this kind of a situation, right? She has way more leniency in terms of the rhetoric that she is using in regards to Hezbollah and in regards to Hamas than I would ever have, right? And even in regards to the subject in general. So credit to her for being able to maintain her composure here. But we have multiple examples here, whether it's Ted Cruz, whether it's John Kennedy, but it's the entirety of the Republican Party and much of the Democratic Party as well, who has this view about Palestinians, who has this view about Arab, or Muslim people in general, whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's in the United States of America. They view them all inherently as terrorists. They view them all inherently as anti-Semites, regardless of what they say, regardless of what their actions are, regardless of whether or not they are the most, productive and kind member of their community. It does not matter. It does not matter to these people. They're not interested in having that kind of a conversation. Because the goal of somebody like Ted Cruz, the goal of somebody like John Kennedy in this situation is to deflect the conversation away from the kind of anti-Muslim or anti-Arab racism that they have helped to gin up in this country, and to reorient the conversation to being anybody who criticizes the government of Israel, anybody who is anti-genocide when it comes to Gaza, or who is critical of the apartheid nature of the government of Israel, is inherently an anti-Semite. They are inherently a threat to the United States. They need to be deported, in the words of Donald Trump. They need to be prosecuted, in the words of Ted Cruz. The only conversation they want to have is what happened on October 7th, where were there potential violations of international law there, and then nothing ever happened before that, and nothing ever happened after that. That's the only conversation that they want to have, right? These students on college campus across the United States, what are they protesting? They're protesting the fact that our government, in violation of both international law and U.S. domestic law, like the Leahy Law, for example, is sending weapons to a government that is dropping those weapons disproportionately, a majority of those weapons on the heads of innocent women and children. This, in a reasonable world, would not even be a conversation as to what needs to happen moving forward in terms of cutting off the weapons, in terms of potentially sanctioning Israel, in terms of actually trying to move forward with a real long-term peace plan. This conversation should not be as disgusting and as complex as it is, because morally, it's not complex. Even politically, it's not that complex. It's made to be complex because we have politicians like John Kennedy, because we have politicians like Ted Cruz, because we have politicians like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris who want to make this out to be some intractable issue that we could never find a solution for, right? And God forbid any sort of potential solution involves putting pressure on the Israeli government to fall in line with international law. God forbid we ever have that conversation. So this entire hearing, from what I've seen from some of these clips, I'm sure some parts of it were productive and some parts of it were useful, but from what I've seen, this was just another classic example. I mean, we've seen time and time again the U.S. government getting together, passing legislation, conflating the idea that, being anti-Zionist is being anti-Semitic. Any criticism of the government of Israel is criticism of the entirety of the Jewish people. We've seen this time and time again. They have passed it into legislation through the U.S. government. I mean, if we cannot have an honest discussion about the brazen violations of international law, about the brazen war crimes that the Israeli government is committing, that the U.S. government is complicit in, then you cannot be respected on the world stage as a state, as a government. You will not be respected on the world stage. The United States government, keep in mind, wants to put forward this idea. We believe in international law, right? We believe in international norms. You cannot do that while supporting what Israel is and has been doing in Gaza for almost a year straight at this point. You cannot do that while continuing to support what Israel is and has been doing in the West Bank, decade after decade after decade. There is a massive contradiction. There is massive hypocrisy that is on full display for the rest of the world right now. So it shouldn't be any sort of mystery why we're losing standing, which, by the way, is another point that needs to be made, is that it's not just about, the U.S. support for Israel and how this will impact the Israeli state, which I think even to the Israeli state, how they've been behaving over the last 11 months is going to be detrimental to them in the long term in terms of the Zionist project. But you also have to do a calculation in terms of, from a U.S. national security perspective, how do you think that this is going to play out? We are on the verge right now with the Israeli government doing these mass pager attacks and walkie-talkie attacks that we've seen over the last couple of days. We are on the verge of the Israeli government dragging the United States into a potential direct war, whether it's with Hezbollah or the Houthis or elements in Iraq and Syria, or whether it's directly with Iran. We are on the verge of getting ourselves into, willingly by the way, getting ourselves into a widespread war in the Middle East once again. And this time directly on behalf of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government. That's what we're on the verge of. And this is something that the U.S. government says we oppose, that we don't want to happen. We don't want escalation. We want peace. We want de-escalation. And yet we are willing to do absolutely nothing to confront the main actor that is dragging us towards that potential future reality. We are willing to sit by in the passenger seat and to allow them to do whatever they want, however they want, whenever they want. And we either have no comment or we have direct praise, even when they engage in widespread acts of terrorism, like what we've just seen in Lebanon over the last couple of days.
Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying